Hi, welcome to my channel, Reader Woman. My name's Judy, and let's talk Wodehouse, or rather, Wodehouse Reads. I am going back to meet Mr. Mulliner, and I thought I would share at least part. I don't think we'll make it through the whole story, but part of it, and we will finish it later. My favorite short story, I think, in the whole Mulliner works. So, and that is Mulliners Buck-U-Uppo. The village choral society had been giving a performance of Gilbert and Sullivan's Sorcerer in aid of the church organ fund. And as we sat in the window of the Angler's Rest, smoking our pipes, the audience came streaming past us down the little street. Snatches of songs floated to our ears, and Mr. Mulliner began to croon in unison. "Ah me, I was a pale young curate then," chanted Mr. Mulliner in the rather snuffling voice in which the amateur singer seemed to find it necessary to render the old songs. "Remarkable," he said, resuming his natural tones, "how fashions change, even in clergymen. There are very few pale young curates around nowadays." "True, I agree. Most of them are beefy young fellows who rode for their colleges. I don't believe I've ever seen a pale young curate." "You never met my nephew, Augustine, I think?" "Never." The description in the song would have fitted him perfectly. You will want to hear all about my nephew, Augustine. "At the time of which I am speaking," said Mr. Mulliner, "my nephew Augustine was a curate, and very young, and extremely pale. As a boy he had completely outgrown his strength, and I rather think that at his theological college some of the wilder spirits must have bullied him. For when he went to Lower Brisket in the Midden to assist the vicar, Reverend Stanley Brandon, in his cure of souls, he was as meek and mild a young man as you would ever meet in a day's journey. He had flaxen hair, weak blue eyes, and the general demeanor of a saintly but timid codfish. Precisely, in short, the sort of young curate who seems to have been so common in the 80s, or whenever it was that Gilbert wrote The Sorcerer. The personality of his immediate superior did little or nothing to help him to overcome his native diffidence. The Reverend Stanley Brandon was a huge and sinewy man of violent temper, whose red face and glittering eyes might well have intimidated the toughest curate. The Reverend Stanley had been a heavyweight boxer at Cambridge, and I gather from Augustine that he seemed to be always on the point of introducing into debates on parish matters the methods which had made him so successful in the roped ring. I remember Augustine telling me once, on the occasion when he had ventured to oppose the other's views in the matter of decorating the church for the Harvest Festival, he thought for a moment that the vicar was going to drop him with a right hook to the chin. It was some quite trivial point that had come up, a question as to whether the pumpkin would look better in the apse or in the clerestory, if I recollect rightly, but for several seconds it seemed as if blood was about to be shed. Such was the Reverend Stanley Brandon, and yet it was to the daughter of this formidable man that Augustine Mulliner had permitted himself to lose his heart. Truly, Cupid makes heroes of us all. Jane was a very nice girl, and just as fond as Augustine as he was of her. But as each lacked the nerve to go to the girl's father and put him abreast of the position of affairs, they were forced to meet surreptitiously. This jarred upon Augustine, who, like all the Mulliners, loved the truth and hated any form of deception. And one evening, as they paced beside the laurels at the bottom of the vicarage garden, he rebelled. "My dearest, I can no longer brook this secrecy. I shall go into the house immediately and ask your father for your hand." Jane paled and clung to his arm. She knew so well that it was not her hand, but her father's foot, which he would receive if he carried out this mad scheme. "No, no, Augustine, you must not. But darling, it is the only straightforward course. But not tonight. I beg of you, not tonight. Why not? Because father is in a very bad temper. He just had a letter from the bishop rebuking him for wearing too many orphreys on his chasuble, and it has upset him terribly. You see, he and the bishop were at school together, and father can never forget it. He said at dinner that if old Boko Bickerton thought he was going to order him about, he would jolly well show him. And the bishop comes here tomorrow for the confirmation services, gasped Augustine. Yes. And I'm so afraid they will quarrel. It's such a pity father hasn't some other bishop over him. He always remembers that he once hit this one in the eye for pouring ink on his collar. And this lowers his respect for his spiritual authority. So you won't go in and tell him tonight, will you? I will not, Augustine assured her with a slight shiver. And you will be sure to put your feet in hot mustard and water when you get home. The dew has made the grass so wet. I will indeed, dearest. You are not strong, you know. No, I am not strong. You ought to take some really good tonic. Perhaps I ought. Good night, Jane. Good night, Augustine. The lovers parted, and Jane slipped back into the vicarage, and Augustine made his way to his cozy rooms in the High Street. And the first thing he noticed on entering was a parcel on the table, and beside it, a letter. He opened it listlessly, his thoughts far away. My dear Augustine. He turned to the last page and glanced at the signature. The letter was from his Aunt Angela, the wife of my brother Wilfred Mulliner. You may remember that I once told you the story of how these two came together. If so, you will recall that my brother Wilfred was the eminent chemical researcher who had invented, among other specifics, such world-famous preparations as Mulliner's Raven Gypsy Face Cream and the Mulliner Snow of the Mountains lotion. He and Augustine had never been particularly intimate, but between Augustine and his aunt, there had always existed a warm friendship. My dear Augustine, wrote Angela Mulliner, I have been thinking so much about you lately, and I cannot forget that when I saw you last, you seemed very fragile and deficient in vitamins. I do hope you take care of yourself. I have been feeling for some time that you ought to take a tonic, and by a lucky chance, Wilfred has just invented one, which he tells me is the finest thing he has ever done. It is called Buck-U-Uppo and acts directly on the red corpuscles. It is not yet on the market, but I have managed to smuggle a sample bottle of from Wilfred's laboratory, and I want you to try it at once. I am sure it is just what you need. Your affectionate aunt, Angela Mulliner. P.S. You take a tablespoon before going to bed and another just before breakfast. Augustine was not an unduly superstitious young man, but the coincidence of this tonic arriving so soon after Jane had told him that a tonic was what he needed affected him deeply. It seemed to him that this thing must have been meant. He shook the bottle, uncorked it, and pouring out a liberal tablespoon, shut his eyes and swallowed it. The medicine, he was glad to find, was not unpleasant to the taste. It had a slightly pungent flavor, rather like the old boot soles beaten up in sherry. Having taken the dose, he read for a while in a book of theological essays and then went to bed. And as his feet slipped between the sheets, he was annoyed to find that Mrs. Wardle, his housekeeper, had once more forgotten his hot water bottle. Oh, dash, said Augustine. He was thoroughly upset. He had told the woman over and over again that he suffered from cold feet and could not get to sleep unless the dogs were properly warmed up. He sprang out of bed and went to the head of the stairs. Mrs. Wardle, he cried. There was no reply. Mrs. Wardle, bellowed Augustine in a voice that rattled the window panes like a strong nor'easter. Until tonight, he had always been very much afraid of his housekeeper and had both walked and talked softly in her presence. But now he was conscious of a strange new fortitude. His head was singing a little, and he felt equal to a dozen Mrs. Wardles. Shuffling footsteps made themselves heard. "Well, what is it now?" asked a querulous voice. "I'll tell you what is now," he roared. "How many times have I told you always to put a hot water bottle on my bed? You've forgotten it again, you old cloth-head." Mrs. Wardle peered up, astounded and militant. "Mr. Mulliner, I am not accustomed—" "Shut up," thundered Augustine. "What I want from you is less backchack and more hot water bottles. Bring it up at once or I leave tomorrow. Let me endeavor to get it into your concrete skull that you aren't the only person letting rooms in this village. Any more lip and I walk straight round the corner where I'll be appreciated. Hot water bottle, ho, and look slippery about it." "Yes, Mr. Mulliner. Certainly, Mr. Mulliner. 1 minute, Mr. Mulliner." "Action, action," boomed Augustine. "Show some speed. Put a little snap into it." "Yes, yes, most decidedly, Mr. Mulliner," replied the chastened voice from below. An hour later, as he was dropping off to sleep, a thought crept into Augustine's mind. Had he not been a little brusque with Mrs. Wardle? Had there not been in his manner something a shade abrupt, almost rude? Yes, he decided regretfully, there had. He lit a candle and reached for the diary which lay on the table at his bedside. He made an entry. "The meek shall inherit the earth. Am I sufficiently meek, I wonder, this evening when reproaching Mrs. Wardle, my worthy housekeeper, for omitting to place a hot water bottle in my bed? I spoke quite crossly. The provocation was severe, but still I was surely to blame for allowing my passions to run riot. Mem must guard against this." But when he woke the next morning, different feelings prevailed. He took his anti-breakfast dose of Buck-U-Uppo and, looking at the entry in the diary, could scarcely believe that it was he who had written it. Quite cross. Of course they'd been quite cross. Wouldn't anybody be quite cross who was forever being persecuted by beetle wits who forgot hot water bottles? Erasing the words with one strong dash of a thick-leaded pencil, he scribbled in the margin a hasty "mashed potatoes," served the old idiot right, and went down to breakfast. And there we shall leave Augustine to take him up next week. Hope you enjoy Wodehouse as much as I do, and let me know if you've read this story or if you are a Mulliner fan or not. So take care and keep reading. Take care. Bye.